Barack Obama is in Athens, as we saw earlier this afternoon, on the first leg of his last European tour as US president. He's holding talks about how to deal with Greece's huge debts, as well as reassuring allies that America won't abandon its partners and key strategic alliances. What isn't clear is how much weight those assurances actually carry, given the rhetoric of President-elect Donald Trump during the election campaign. Well, let's speak now to Anneke Green, a former George W. Bush speechwriter with the White House Speechwriters Group. Thank you very much for joining us, Anneke. And you've worked on major speeches such as State of the Union addresses. Let's think first of all about what sort of inauguration address Donald Trump is going to make. He'll need, of course, to speak to those who elected him. He'll also need to speak to the people who didn't.
Yes, that's the case. And I would like to make a quick distinction. He'll be making an inaugural address, which is when he's sworn in, and then he will also be making a State of the Union address, which will be later in January, where he addresses both houses of Congress and the American people and the world at large. But he will be laying out his domestic agenda in the State of the Union address. His inaugural address, we should look to see a much broader, more inclusive explanation of his vision, which would be more in keeping with the speech that he was giving the night of his victory.
And do you expect him, certainly in the first instance anyway, in the early days of his presidency, to fall partly in line, at least, with Republican orthodoxy, or is he going to want to strike out and be a very different president, both in words and deeds?
He's made very clear throughout the campaign and even in the wake of his victory that he's planning to set his own agenda and that he's not going to be following anybody else's plan for that, whether it's Republican, what's called Republican orthodoxy, or a vision or an agenda from congressional leaders. And so far, everyone's saying we want to work together. He's gone to the Hill, he's had meetings, and even things that are causing some headlines like his most recently announced staff picks. You see all of the Republican leadership saying we have the utmost confidence in him, and they're so far resisting the invitation to seem like they're not united.
Okay, so an interesting time for his speechwriters then.
Definitely.
We're just seeing in the last few moments before we talk to you, actually, some news coming through from Washington that the retired neurosurgeon Ben Carson, who himself, of course, was a Republican presidential candidate, has opted against accepting a cabinet position in the Trump administration, according to Mr. Carson's spokesman, saying that he has no experience in running a federal bureaucracy. I mean, interesting given that he was running for president at one point, interesting because it also highlights Donald Trump's lack of experience in running a federal bureaucracy.
Well, Donald Trump had campaigned on his experience as a businessman and CEO, which I think would be a little bit different than what Ben Carson is saying, which is he's been a doctor. He hasn't had to make staffing decisions and policy calls in the same way that the head of a cabinet would have to make or that a president would have to make. Donald Trump has made clear the entire time he's very comfortable with those decisions and actually looks forward to bringing business experience to what has been characterized as a sort of bloated, oversized agency, the executive branch that has just been getting larger and larger, which a lot of Americans are concerned about, whether in terms of size or in terms of scope.
Well, let's expand on that, because you touched on the sort of message that Donald Trump is sending with his appointments. And of course, you were a speechwriter for George W. Bush, the last Republican administration. How do you think the Trump administration is going to compare to that?
Well, I think the Trump administration will be very different. It will be its own, they will be setting their own agenda, and it will be its own creature, ultimately. We have never seen anybody campaign the way Donald Trump has, and I think he brought his background in television to his experience as a politician and as a candidate, which was really hard for people to understand at times. And I think he had the viewpoint that any news is good news for you, any headlines, and he campaigned that way. I don't see him acting that way as president, and I think that his somewhat subdued demeanor and the things he said coming out of meetings with Barack Obama. He's come across as very humble, as wanting to hear from people, and I think he intends to govern that way as well. I don't think it's a my way or the highway all the time. I think that he is going into the job thinking, I'm going to negotiate, and there will be a lot of things on the table, at least in the initial negotiations, that typically more seasoned politicians don't even want to go there because they see it as not feasible, which will be interesting to see how congressional leaders end up dealing with that, because that's not typically how they do things.
And of course, we know that he provokes a lot of skepticism from a huge amount of the population in the United States, downright antagonism from many of them. How do you think he is going to cope with that? I mean, it was interesting in the wake of those protests in the next couple of nights after his election victory. He at first said they were unfair, and then he changed his tune, didn't he, and said, oh, well, actually, you know, these people have a great passion. They're out expressing their point of view. So how is he going to cope with that sort of dissent?
I think that he shows that he's willing to grow in his understanding of whatever situation he's faced with, which is what we would hope for out of any chief executive. So initially, maybe his first blush reaction to something may be something a little different than where he arrives, and I think that that's what you need in a president as well. You need somebody who's going to listen to his advisors and then ultimately, as we all hope, make the best decision. I don't think anybody wants someone who goes in with a preset idea, notions that they're just going to be implementing regardless of what facts they learn or situation on the ground. And I'd say the best example of his hopefully being that way is the fact that his meeting with Barack Obama, which was scheduled to be about 10 or 15 minutes in the White House after he became president-elect, stretched to about 90 minutes. And he came out of that saying it could have been much longer. He was very interested in what he was learning from President Obama, and President Obama came out of that as well, saying, I was happy to spend this time with him, and I'm happy to be a resource to him in the future. And you could not find two politicians who have different agendas.
Sorry to interrupt, just finally, briefly, I mean, you're someone who helps politicians put their narrative together, put their thoughts into words. How do you think the Democrats are going to try to kick back against this, given that we have a Republican president-elect and a Republican-controlled Congress?
Well, they've already started by looking at their own leadership and seeing if there's something they need to change internally. I think that they will be looking to hold the line on some of the legacy that President Obama has instituted and not just cave in those ways. But it's going to be tough for them because not only did Democrats lose the White House, they also did not take the Senate or the House, and they lost a lot of statewide races. There are a lot more Republican governors now. So it shows that the people are not on board with the Democratic agenda at this point.
Okay, Anneke Green, thank you very much for your time today.